A raise? You should be grateful we even keep you. Victor laughed, his voice bouncing off the conference room walls. I sat perfectly still in my chair, the quarterly performance review folder open before me. 7 years of exceptional evaluations. 7 years without a single pay increase. Penny, your request is. Diane, the CFO, tilted her head with exaggerated sympathy. Ambitious, considering market conditions. The leadership team exchanged knowing glances around the table. 8 people who collectively made decisions about my worthwhile, knowing nothing about what I actually did for them. I developed the calibration method that increased our precision by 37%, I said, keeping my voice steady. Production time was cut in half. The Eastbrook contract alone, which we secured through aggressive negotiation tactics, interrupted Ben, VP of Sales, though we both knew it was my technical specifications that won that deal. I've trained 16 junior technicians since I started. I've personally troubleshot critical issues for our top clients. The European expansion would have collapsed if I hadn't. Team effort, Victor cut in, drumming his fingers on the polished surface. Everyone pulls their weight here, Penny. My salary hasn't changed since I was hired. I'm only asking to align with current industry standards. Victor leaned back, exchanging amused glances with the others. Industry standards are for average contributors. If you want extraordinary compensation, show us extraordinary results. My chest tightened. The calibration breakthrough I'd pioneered had generated millions. Last quarter's report, which I wasn't supposed to have seen, attributed a 28% profit increase directly to proprietary technical innovations. The numbers speak for themselves, I said, sliding the market research across the table. Engineers with my qualifications and output are compensated at least 30% higher. Victor didn't even glance at my carefully prepared documents. He simply pushed them back. A raise? You should be grateful we even keep you, the VP laughed during my review. The whole leadership team nodded in agreement. I stood up, placed an envelope on the table, and said, "Thank you for your time." 3 days later, when they opened it and saw where I was going, their panic calls began flooding my phone. If you're still with me, you understand what it feels like when your worth is dismissed by people who profit from your brilliance. Hit that like button if you've ever been undervalued, and subscribe to hear how this story unfolds. Because what happens next changed an entire industry. My name is Penelope Wright, Penny to most, and until 3 weeks ago, I was the lead calibration engineer at Midwest Manufacturing Specialists. Not that you'd know it from my title, which remained Technical Specialist 2 despite my responsibilities expanding year after year. I grew up taking apart every device in our house, much to my parents' dismay. By 12, I could reassemble a vacuum cleaner with improved suction. At 16, I modified my high school's equipment to achieve measurements their budget couldn't afford. My engineering professors in college called me Precision Penny, a nickname that followed me into my professional life. When I joined Midwest, I was grateful for the opportunity. The company manufactured industrial equipment for sectors ranging from aerospace to medical technology. My starting salary seemed reasonable for a recent graduate, and the promise of growth kept me motivated through long hours and demanding projects. The calibration breakthrough came during my second year. For months, I'd noticed inconsistencies in our testing apparatus, tiny variations that others dismissed as acceptable margin. But in precision manufacturing, those margins represented the difference between excellence and adequacy. I spent weekends experimenting with alternative methods, using my own equipment purchased piece by piece from my modest salary. The solution came to me at 3 in the morning, a hybrid approach that integrated digital measurements with mechanical fine-tuning in a sequence nobody had tried before. When I demonstrated my method to the engineering team, the results were immediate. Precision improved dramatically, while cutting calibration time from 6 hours to just under 3. The production floor implemented my technique within a week, and suddenly our products outperformed every competitor in accuracy tests. Orders increased, quality complaints disappeared. Client retention hit 100% for the first time in company history. I waited for recognition, a promotion, a bonus, even just acknowledgement in the company newsletter. Instead, in the quarterly meeting, my innovation was presented as our new proprietary method, with no mention of my name. Victor took questions from impressed board members while I sat silently in the back row. "This is how business works," my colleague Jamie told me afterward. "Individual recognition isn't how you advance here. Be patient." So I was patient. I trained new hires on my calibration method. I documented every step so production wouldn't suffer during my rare sick days. I answered calls from clients at midnight when their equipment needed emergency adjustments. The European expansion came in my 5th year. Regulatory standards differed significantly from American requirements, and the first shipment of machines failed inspection spectacularly. The expansion team was in crisis, with millions in equipment sitting in warehouses, unusable. "Penny, we need solutions, not explanations," Victor said during the emergency meeting. "Either fix this, or we'll find someone who can." I canceled plans for the next 6 weekends. My relationship with Luis ended when I missed his sister's wedding. I redesigned critical components, revised testing protocols, and created new calibration standards specifically for European requirements. By the 7th week, our equipment passed inspection with scores exceeding local manufacturers. The company celebrated the successful expansion with a party I couldn't attend. I was on a video call with German technicians, walking them through implementation. Each year, my performance reviews praised my dedication and technical expertise. Each year, my compensation remained unchanged. When I raised the issue, I was told the company was restructuring or consolidating resources or emphasizing team achievements over individual contributions. I watched newer employees, usually men with half my experience, negotiate starting salaries higher than what I was making after 6 years. "That's just how negotiation works," Human Resources explained when I inquired. "Your performance is valued, but we can't disrupt internal equity by adjusting established employees." So I stopped asking and started applying elsewhere. The offers came quickly. My reputation in the industry had spread, despite the company's effort to brand my innovations as their collective achievement. I declined 3 positions out of misplaced loyalty before an unexpected email arrived in my personal inbox. "Your calibration method has revolutionized equipment precision standards," wrote Olivia, director of the Industrial Certification Authority. "We're creating a new position, Chief Innovation Officer, to modernize certification protocols across the industry. Based on your contributions to the field, we'd like to discuss your interest." The ICA sets the standards that every manufacturer in our sector must meet. Their certification is the difference between market access and bankruptcy. Their offer included compensation that made my current salary look like a clerical error, plus authority to shape industry practices. I met with Olivia for dinner, intending only to gather information. 3 hours later, surrounded by empty plates and pages of notes about potential improvements to certification standards, I realized I'd found my path forward. "I need 2 weeks to properly transition my current projects," I told her as we parted. "Take the time you need," she replied. "We've waited years for someone with your vision. A few more weeks won't matter." I decided to give Midwest one final chance. I prepared extensive documentation showing my contributions, market salary data, and a modest request that would still leave me underpaid but would acknowledge my value. I scheduled my annual review early and arrived with hope that rationality might prevail. Instead, I got laughter and dismissal. As I walked back to my workstation after the meeting, a strange calm settled over me. 7 years of doubt about my worth dissolved in an instant. Their reaction wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a revelation of how they truly saw me, disposable despite being irreplaceable. I sent a brief email accepting Olivia's offer before starting my afternoon tasks. That evening, I drafted my resignation letter. 2 paragraphs, professional and concise. I mentioned no grievances, made no accusations. I simply stated that I would be departing in 2 weeks to pursue another opportunity and would ensure all my projects were properly transitioned. I slipped the letter into an envelope and placed it in my bag for tomorrow. My phone lit up with a text from Jamie. "How'd the review go?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, "Exactly as expected." The next morning, I arrived at work as usual. I greeted security, prepared my workstation, and began addressing urgent client requests. At precisely 9:30, I walked to the conference room where the leadership team was having their daily briefing. I knocked once and entered. 8 pairs of eyes turned to me with mild surprise. "Penny, we're in the middle of something," Victor said, annoyed at the interruption. I approached the table silently and placed the envelope in the center. "Thank you for your time," I said, and walked out, closing the door behind me. The envelope remained unopened for 3 days. I continued working, documenting processes, and training colleagues on aspects of my role that only I understood. No one mentioned my unusual appearance at the leadership meeting. No one asked about the envelope. On the 3rd day, While I was calibrating equipment for our newest client, my phone began vibrating continuously in my pocket. 6 missed calls from human resources, 4 from Victor, 2 from Diane. I turned it off and finished my calibration. What happened next would reshape not just my career, but an entire industry's standards of excellence and accountability. And it all began with a simple, unopened envelope. When I returned to my desk, Heather, from HR, was waiting. "Penny," she lowered her voice. "Victor opened your letter. He's concerned. Can we talk privately?" I followed her to a small conference room where Victor and Diane were already seated. Victor pushed my resignation letter across the table. "What is this?" he asked, as though the clearly stated resignation was written in hieroglyphics. "My 2 weeks' notice," I replied. "I've accepted another position." "Where?" Diane demanded. "I'd prefer not to discuss that until I begin my new role." Victor leaned forward, his demeanor transformed from yesterday's mockery to today's desperation. "Penny, we may have been hasty during your review. Let's revisit your compensation request." "The leadership team was having a difficult day," Heather added. "We value your contributions tremendously." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I've already accepted another offer." "Whatever they're paying, we'll match it," Diane said. I thought about 7 years of denied requests, of watching less qualified colleagues advance while I remained stationary, of weekend work and midnight troubleshooting, of innovations attributed to the company rather than to me. "This isn't about money," I said, though partly it was. "It's about finding the right opportunity for my career growth." "We can create a new position," Victor offered, "Senior Technical Specialist. With a team reporting to you." "Thank you, but my decision is final." They continued with escalating offers, as though negotiating with a hostage-taker. By the time I left that room, they'd promised a 50% raise, a director title, and a seat on the innovation committee. The same committee that had rejected my improvement proposals for years. I declined each offer with increasing certainty. The next 2 weeks were surreal. Colleagues who had barely acknowledged me for years suddenly wanted lunch. Executives who couldn't remember my name stopped by my workstation with technical questions that revealed how little they understood about our own products. I documented everything meticulously: calibration procedures, troubleshooting protocols, client-specific modifications. I created training materials for processes I'd previously maintained alone. I transferred knowledge accumulated over 7 years into organized files, accessible to anyone who might need them. On my final day, I handed over my projects to 3 different engineers, each taking a portion of my responsibilities. My desk, always minimal, took less than 10 minutes to clear. Victor appeared as I was signing final paperwork with HR. "This is a mistake, Penny," he said, following me toward the exit. "You're throwing away 7 years of building your career here." I stopped at the security desk and handed over my badge. "Those 7 years provided valuable experience. I'm grateful for that. At least tell us where you're going," he pressed as we reached the lobby. "We should stay in touch." I considered various responses before settling on simple truth: the Industrial Certification Authority. Today was my last day here, but I don't start there for 3 weeks. "I'm taking some time off." His face paled. "The ICA? In what capacity?" "Chief Innovation Officer." Victor's expression collapsed into something between panic and disbelief. He knew, as everyone in our industry knew, that the ICA's standards determined which products reached market and which failed. Their certification process could accelerate or destroy a company's future. His voice dropped to a whisper. "We should talk about this." "We've had 7 years to talk," I replied. "Goodbye, Victor." I walked through the glass doors into bright spring sunshine, the weight of unappreciated years falling away with each step toward my car. Those 3 weeks between jobs were the first real break I'd taken since college. I visited my parents in Michigan, hiked trails I'd always been too busy to explore, and slept without setting an alarm. I declined 14 calls from various Midwest manufacturing numbers and deleted their voicemails unheard. On my first day at the ICA, Olivia personally showed me to my office, an actual office with a door and windows, not the shared workstation I'd occupied for 7 years. "The certification standards haven't been substantially updated in nearly a decade," she explained. "Technology has evolved, but our requirements haven't kept pace. Your first project is to modernize our approach, particularly in precision measurement protocols." I spent my first month learning the organization, reviewing current standards, and identifying outdated requirements. By the 6th week, I'd drafted preliminary revisions that would raise industry standards to reflect current technological capabilities. These are significant changes, noted Xavier, the technical review director, during our planning meeting. Some manufacturers will struggle to comply. Any manufacturer using current best practices will meet these standards, I replied. The changes primarily affect those using outdated methods or taking shortcuts. Like ignoring calibration drift over time? Xavier asked. Exactly like that, I said, thinking of how Midwest routinely extended recalibration intervals to save costs, a practice I'd repeatedly flagged as potentially dangerous. The standards revision process took 3 months of meticulous work, peer review, and industry consultation. Throughout, I maintained strict professional ethics, never targeting specific manufacturers or creating requirements that only benefited certain companies. The new standards simply reflected what was truly possible with modern technology, precision levels I had personally achieved years earlier. When the updated standards were published, my phone rang within hours. Penny? It's Jamie from Midwest. Have you seen what the ICA just released? I wrote what the ICA just released, I replied. These precision requirements, the calibration schedules, they're impossible. They're not impossible. I implemented similar standards at Midwest 3 years ago, but they were never formally adopted because of cost concerns. Silence stretched across the line before Jamie spoke again. Our certification renewal is due next month. We're nowhere near compliant with these new requirements. The ICA offers implementation consulting for companies transitioning to the new standards, I said, reciting our official position. I can refer you to that department if you'd like. Jamie declined, and I later learned Midwest had hired an external consultant at premium rates. 2 weeks later, my assistant notified me that Midwest Manufacturing had requested an expedited pre-assessment review, a service we offered to companies concerned about their certification status. The review was assigned to one of our senior inspectors, maintaining my professional distance from my former employer. The inspector's report arrived on my desk with a large red flag notification. Midwest's equipment failed to meet the new standards by significant margins. Their calibration procedures were outdated, their precision measurements inconsistent, and their quality control documentation inadequate. I forwarded the report to our certification committee with standard recommendations for improvement paths. No special treatment, positive or negative, just the facts. 3 days later, Victor called my direct line. Penny, he began without greeting. We need to discuss these new certification requirements. All communication regarding certification should go through official channels, I replied. The implementation team can assist with your transition plan. This isn't about implementation, he snapped. These standards are clearly designed to target our processes specifically. This feels personal. The standards apply equally to all manufacturers in the sector, I said. Many companies are already in compliance. Others are successfully implementing updates. You know exactly what you're doing, he accused. You're using your position to punish us for not giving you that raise. I let his words hang in the air for a moment. Victor, I'm recording this call as per ICA policy for all certification discussions. Would you like to rephrase your statement for the record? He hung up. Midwest's formal certification review came due while I was presenting at an international standards conference in Vienna. The committee evaluated their application without my input, following our established protocols. Their findings: provisional certification only, with mandatory compliance checks every 30 days until full standards were met. In industry terms, this was a significant blow. Provisional certification carried limitations on new contracts and required disclosures to existing clients about compliance status. For a company that had previously enjoyed automatic renewals, thanks largely to my behind-the-scenes corrections before official inspections, this represented both a practical and reputational crisis. Upon my return, I found 27 messages from various Midwest executives, escalating in urgency and desperation. I responded with a single email directing all certification inquiries to our official channels, copying our ethics compliance officer to maintain transparency. The industry summit 6 months later highlighted how dramatically standards had shifted. My keynote presentation on precision requirements for next-generation manufacturing drew attendees from 4 continents. In the front row sat Midwest's leadership team, including Victor and Diane, taking notes with the focused attention of students before a final exam. During the networking reception afterward, Ben from Midwest approached me, champagne glass in hand but sobriety in his expression. Impressive presentation, he said. We've hired 3 specialists to implement the new standards, but progress is challenging. Quality improvement is always a journey, I replied neutrally. We've invested nearly $7 million in equipment upgrades, he continued. Ironically, these are the same upgrades you requested in your last budget proposal with us. I sipped my water, saying nothing. The thing is, Ben lowered his voice, we're still struggling with the calibration protocol. The documentation you left wasn't quite complete. The documentation was comprehensive for the methods in use at that time. I corrected him. The new standards require different approaches, which you pioneered, he noted. Look, Victor wants to meet with you, privately, to discuss consulting opportunities. I maintained my professional smile. ICA staff are prohibited from private consulting with entities we certify. That would represent a conflict of interest. He's prepared to make it worth your while, Ben pressed. That would be illegal, I stated firmly. And this conversation is becoming inappropriate. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm. You don't understand. Without full certification by quarter's end, we lose the Eastbrook contract. That's 30% of our annual revenue. I gently removed his hand. Then I suggest you focus your energy on meeting the standards rather than circumventing them. As I walked away, Diane intercepted me near the exhibition hall entrance. Penny, she began with artificial warmth. You look wonderful. This new position clearly agrees with you. Thank you, I replied. If you'll excuse me, I have a panel discussion to moderate. Just 1 minute, she persisted. We've been doing some restructuring at Midwest, creating a new division focused on precision technology advancement. The board has approved an exceptional compensation package for the right leadership candidate. I met her gaze directly. Are you offering me a job, Diane? We're exploring possibilities with someone who understands our unique challenges. Someone who could help you meet the new certification standards? Someone who recognizes the practical realities of implementation timelines, she countered. I smiled politely. I believe the ICA's implementation guidelines already provide realistic timelines for companies committed to quality improvement. Companies that can survive those timelines, she muttered. The statement hung between us, revealing more than she intended. Midwest wasn't just struggling, they were in serious trouble. If Midwest manufacturing can't meet industry standards, I said carefully, perhaps there are more fundamental business challenges to address than just certification requirements. Her pleasant facade cracked slightly. You know exactly what you're doing to us. Applying the same standards to all manufacturers that I apply to myself? I suggested. Yes, I do know exactly what I'm doing. As I walked away, Victor appeared from a side hallway, moving to intercept me. His usual confident stride had diminished to something almost tentative. His face showed the strain of months fighting against the inevitable. 2 minutes, he said, stepping into my path. That's all I ask. Against my better judgment, I paused. We made a terrible mistake, he admitted, lowering his voice. Would you consider consulting for us? Name your price. I studied the man who had laughed at my request for fair compensation after years of dedication, who had taken credit for my innovations while denying me advancement, who now stood before me not as a powerful executive, but as someone desperate for salvation. I'm afraid I'm quite grateful for my current position, I replied, echoing his dismissive words from our last performance review. As I stepped around him toward the panel discussion, he called after me, "This isn't over, Penny." I turned back briefly. You're right about that, Victor. For Midwest manufacturing, this is just beginning. What I couldn't tell him, what I couldn't tell anyone yet, was that the true reckoning was still coming. Because while updating industry standards had created problems for my former employer, those changes were never about revenge. They were simply good business practice, long overdue improvements that benefited the entire sector. My actual plan was only now entering its final phase. The panel discussion on ethics in technical innovation was my last official event at the summit. As experts debated the boundaries between proprietary methods and industry standards, I noticed Victor slipping out of the auditorium, phone pressed to his ear, face tense with urgency. 2 weeks later, industry news reported that Midwest Manufacturing had secured an emergency loan to fund strategic improvements. Reading between the lines, they were burning cash to meet certification requirements before losing major contracts. Back at ICA headquarters, my team had begun the second phase of our standards modernization, transparent attribution protocols. This new framework would require companies to properly credit technical innovations to their original developers, both to recognize individual contributions and to create clear chains of intellectual ownership. The patent system already does this, argued one board member during our proposal review. Patents are expensive, time-consuming, and often impractical for process innovations, I explained. Many breakthrough methods are developed by employees who lack resources to patent their work independently, while companies claim these innovations as proprietary without acknowledging creators. After 3 hours of debate, the board approved the initiative with one significant modification. It would be implemented as a voluntary certification enhancement for the first year, becoming mandatory in the second. Companies need time to adjust their documentation practices, the board chair explained. This gives them a transition period while still rewarding early adopters. Perfect. The voluntary phase would serve my purposes even better than a mandatory rollout. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor at my office as I was preparing to leave. Penny, got a minute? Jamie stood in my doorway, looking uncomfortable in formal attire instead of the casual clothes we'd worn at Midwest. Jamie, what are you doing here? I interviewed with your implementation team this morning, she said. They offered me a position starting next month. I gestured to a chair. Congratulations. But why would you leave Midwest? You've been there longer than I was. Jamie's expression darkened. Things have changed since you left. They brought in consultants who blame everyone but leadership for the certification problems. 3 senior engineers were let go last week for failure to maintain technical standards. That's not surprising, I said, but disappointing. There's more, Jamie continued, leaning forward. They've been going through your old files, claiming you deliberately sabotaged documentation before leaving. Victor told the board you orchestrated the new standards specifically to damage Midwest. I smiled slightly. And yet, they've offered me jobs and consulting contracts repeatedly since I left. Desperation makes people inconsistent, she shrugged. But listen, I'm not here just about the job. I thought you should know they're developing a formal complaint against you and the ICA, alleging conflict of interest in the standards development process. My smile widened. Are they really? Jamie studied my expression. You don't seem concerned. Because I've done nothing wrong, I replied. Every step in our standards development was documented, peer-reviewed, and approved through proper channels. My personal history with Midwest was disclosed and properly managed. They're saying you had access to proprietary information that you're now using against them. The certification standards contain nothing proprietary to Midwest, I said. They reflect industry best practices that dozens of manufacturers already implement successfully. Jamie nodded slowly. That's what I figured, but they're desperate. The Eastbrook contract is hanging by a thread, and 3 other major clients are reviewing their options. As Jamie left for her orientation meeting, I considered the implications. A formal complaint would be inconvenient but ultimately beneficial to my plan. It would trigger exactly the type of scrutiny I'd been carefully preparing for. The next morning, I received a formal notice that Midwest Manufacturing had indeed filed a complaint with the ICA's Ethics Committee and the Industry Oversight Board. They alleged that I had weaponized inside knowledge and manipulated certification requirements to target specific operational methods used by Midwest. I forwarded the complaint to our legal team with a brief note. Proceeding as anticipated. Please implement Protocol 37. Protocol 37 was our standard response to certification challenges. A. Comprehensive review of all documentation related to standards development, including every draft, comment, and revision. It was typically a 3-week process that produced hundreds of pages of evidence supporting our methodologies. For the next month, I continued my regular duties while the ethics investigation proceeded. I made no public comments about Midwest, maintained strict professional boundaries, and focused on our new attribution framework. 3 manufacturing leaders approached me about early adoption of the attribution standards, eager to position themselves as ethical innovators. I worked closely with their teams to implement the voluntary certification, establishing processes that would later become industry models. 6 weeks after filing their complaint, Midwest requested an urgent meeting with the ICA board. As Chief Innovation Officer, I was invited but recused myself due to the ongoing ethics investigation. Instead, I prepared a detailed brief for the board and watched the proceedings via closed circuit from my office. Victor led Midwest's presentation, flanked by their legal team and 2 external consultants. Gone was the desperate man from the summit. Today, he projected confident indignation. The new standards are technically sound, he conceded, but their implementation timeline is punitive and appears targeted at specific manufacturers, including Midwest. We believe this represents a conflict of interest related to Ms. Wright's previous employment. The board chair responded with practice neutrality. The Ethics Committee has completed its investigation of your allegations. Their findings have been distributed to all parties. Victor accepted the thick folder handed to him, but continued without opening it. Furthermore, we've discovered evidence that Miss Wright deliberately withheld critical calibration documentation before her departure, making compliance unnecessarily difficult. This was a serious accusation, one that could damage my professional reputation if it gained traction. The board chair glanced at the Ethics Committee representative, who nodded and stood. Actually, that specific allegation was anticipated and investigated thoroughly. Page 47 of our report addresses documentation protocols at Midwest Manufacturing during Miss Wright's tenure. Victor flipped to the page, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as he read. As you can see, the committee representative continued, Miss Wright maintained exceptional documentation standards. Her departure materials included 2,347 pages of technical documentation, 126 training videos, and detailed transition notes for each project. We've compared this to industry benchmarks and found it exceeds standard practices by approximately 340%. This doesn't align with our internal assessment, Victor argued. Critical calibration sequences were missing from the documentation. If I may, interjected Xavier, our technical director. The committee investigated this specific claim by reviewing the documentation package Miss Wright provided upon departure. We found the calibration sequences fully documented in Section 12.3, with cross-references to implementation guides in appendices E through G. Victor conferred hurriedly with his team. I watched his face flush as someone showed him something on a tablet. It appears, he said finally, that some documentation may have been misfiled internally after Miss Wright's departure, or deliberately hidden, suggested a board member, to support this complaint. The meeting deteriorated from there. Midwest's allegations collapsed under scrutiny, with each claim systematically dismantled by evidence I had meticulously prepared over 7 years. You see, my revenge was never about creating impossible standards or targeting my former employer. It was about something far more powerful, creating a system where truth could not be buried, where contributions could not be stolen, and where excellence could not be exploited without recognition. For 7 years, I had documented everything, not just technical processes, but every interaction where my ideas were appropriated, every email where credit was reassigned, every meeting where my contributions were minimized. I had maintained dual records, the official documentation that met all professional requirements, and my personal archive that told the true story of innovation at Midwest Manufacturing. When I joined the ICA, I didn't need to target Midwest. I simply needed to create systems that would naturally expose what had been happening there all along. The attribution framework was the final piece, not because it would force Midwest to acknowledge me, that time had passed, but because it would prevent them from doing to others what they had done to me. 2 days after the failed complaint hearing, Midwest's board of directors announced an internal investigation into potential misrepresentation by senior leadership regarding technical capabilities. Within a week, Victor and 2 other executives were placed on administrative leave. The Industry Oversight Board initiated a separate investigation into potential securities violations related to materially misleading statements about proprietary technologies in Midwest's investor communications. Those communications had claimed ownership of innovations that were actually my uncredited work. 3 weeks later, as these investigations intensified, I received another visitor. Diane stood awkwardly at my office doorway, looking diminished without her executive armor. The board asked me to come, she said without preamble. We're facing serious consequences from the failed certification and the investigations. Our stock has dropped 60%. Eastbrook terminated their contract yesterday. I waited, saying nothing. The board wants to negotiate, she continued. They're prepared to offer public acknowledgement of your contributions, back pay for the raises you should have received, and naming rights for the calibration method. Why would I want any of that now? I asked. Because without it, Midwest won't survive another quarter, she admitted. 400 people will lose their jobs, not just leadership, engineers, technicians, people who had nothing to do with how you were treated. I considered her words carefully. The attribution framework offers a path forward for companies willing to honestly document their innovation history. Midwest could be among the first to adopt it. That would mean admitting publicly that leadership took credit for work we didn't do, she said. Yes, I replied simply. It would mean telling the truth. She nodded slowly. I'll take that to the board, But Penny, was this your plan all along? From the moment you placed that envelope on the table? I met her gaze directly. My plan was to create an industry where innovation is properly attributed and excellence is properly valued. What's happening to Midwest is simply the natural consequence of years of decisions made by its leadership. The following month, Midwest Manufacturing became the fourth company to adopt the attribution framework. Their implementation included a public reconciliation of innovation credits, acknowledging 26 engineers whose contributions had previously been attributed to proprietary company methods. My name led the list, with 17 distinct innovations spanning 7 years. Victor and 3 other executives resigned. The new CEO, promoted from engineering management, introduced a transparent compensation structure tied directly to innovation contributions. Jamie withdrew her ICA employment application and returned to Midwest to lead their attribution compliance team. 6 months later, Midwest received full certification under the new standards. Their stock price had stabilized, and while the Eastbrook contract was gone forever, new clients attracted by their ethical transformation had filled much of the gap. At the next industry summit, I presented the final version of the attribution framework, now adopted by over 60% of certified manufacturers. As I concluded my presentation, I noticed a familiar face in the back row, Luis, my ex-boyfriend, now working for a competing certification body. Any questions? I asked the audience. Luis raised his hand. How do you respond to critics who say this framework primarily benefits individual innovators at the expense of corporate investment? I smiled. Innovation without attribution is appropriation. Companies that understand this attract the best talent, produce the best products, and ultimately deliver the best returns to investors. This isn't about individuals versus corporations. It's about creating an ecosystem where excellence is recognized, rewarded, and therefore replicated. As the audience applauded, I thought about that envelope I'd placed on the conference table a year earlier. The revenge wasn't in leaving Midwest. It wasn't even in exposing their practices. The true revenge was in creating a world where what happened to me couldn't happen to anyone else. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Have you ever had your contributions overlooked or appropriated? Share your experience in the comments below. Remember, recognition may be delayed, but excellence leaves evidence that eventually tells its own story.